Wife appears weak in court, until her family and hidden love surprise everyone. The silent wife. The Manhattan courthouse felt like a cathedral of judgment, its high ceilings echoing with the sound of expensive shoes on marble floors. Amora Bennett sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded in her lap, a picture of composure that belied the storm inside her chest. She wore a simple navy dress, no jewelry except her wedding band, a band she would soon be free to remove. Across the aisle, Victor Ashford commanded attention like a king in his domain. His tailored suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Holden, shuffled through papers with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case. Victor leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched Amora with barely concealed contempt. Mrs. Ashford lived a life of luxury, Patricia began, her voice cutting through the courtroom. Designer clothes, exotic vacations, a penthouse apartment with views of Central Park. She contributed nothing to the marriage except spending my client's hard-earned money. Amora felt the words like physical blows, but she kept her face neutral. Years of marriage to Victor had taught her how to hide her pain, how to become small and invisible when his temper flared. In the gallery behind her, she could feel the presence of her family. Her brother Elias sat rigid with controlled anger, his jaw clenched tight. Beside him, their mother Celeste radiated a calm strength that Amora had always admired but never quite mastered herself. They had flown in from Boston the moment she filed for divorce, refusing to let her face this alone. The courtroom doors opened with a soft creak, and a late arrival slipped inside. Amora didn't turn to look, but something about the movement made her heart skip unexpectedly. "Your Honor," Patricia continued, "my client is willing to offer a modest settlement, far more generous than Mrs. Ashford deserves given her lack of contribution to." Objection. Amora's lawyer, a seasoned attorney named Robert Chen, rose to his feet. Mrs. Ashford supported her husband's career for 8 years, sacrificing her own ambitions. The law recognizes. Sacrificed. Victor's voice cut through the proceedings, dripping with disdain. "She did nothing but enjoy the fruits of my labor." Judge Martha Reynolds, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, raised her hand for silence. "Mr. Ashford, you will speak only when addressed. Continue, Mr. Chen." As Robert outlined the preliminary arguments, Amora allowed herself a glance backward. Her eyes met those of the late arrival, and time seemed to freeze. Daniel Foster sat in the back row, his familiar face older now, marked by the years since they'd last seen each other, but his eyes held the same gentle warmth she remembered from their childhood in Boston. What was he doing here? She hadn't seen Daniel in over a decade, not since before she'd met Victor at that charity gala where she'd been foolish enough to fall for charm and wealth instead of substance. Daniel gave her the smallest nod, a gesture of support that somehow steadied her more than anything else that morning. She turned back to face the judge, but something had shifted inside her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel quite so alone. Family rising. The second day of the trial brought a different energy to the courtroom. Amora arrived early, her mother's hand warm in hers as they climbed the courthouse steps. Elias walked ahead, carrying a briefcase filled with documents they'd spent months gathering, proof of the truth Victor had tried so hard to bury. "The defense calls Elias Bennett to the stand," Robert announced, and Amora watched her brother rise with quiet determination. Elias took the oath with steady hands, then fixed his gaze on the judge rather than Victor. "I've known my sister for 32 years, he began. "I watched her transform from a vibrant artist into a shadow of herself during her marriage to Victor Ashford." Patricia jumped to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is character assassination, not testimony." "I'll allow it," Judge Reynolds said. "Continue, Mr. Bennett." Elias pulled out bank statements, receipts, and documented correspondence. "While my sister supposedly contributed nothing, she was actually managing Victor's household, organizing his business dinners, and maintaining the social connections that helped him close deals worth millions. But more than that," he paused, his voice hardening. "She endured his affairs." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Victor's face flushed red, his composure cracking. "I have here photographs from a private investigator," Elias continued, sliding evidence across to Robert. 4 different women over the course of 6 years. Hotel receipts. Text messages Victor was careless enough to leave on a shared tablet. Amora watched Victor's lawyer whisper frantically in his ear. For the first time, she saw fear flicker across her husband's face. When Celeste took the stand next, her testimony carried the weight of maternal wisdom. She spoke of Amora's depression, the prescription medications she'd needed just to function, the night Celeste had held her daughter while she cried over the phone. "My daughter gave up her dream of becoming an art teacher," Celeste said softly. Victor convinced her that her career was unnecessary, even embarrassing to him. She believed him because she loved him. During the lunch recess, Amora found herself alone in a small conference room, overwhelmed by the morning's revelations. The door opened quietly, and Daniel entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Your mother said you take it with cream and honey," he said, offering her one. Amora accepted it with trembling hands. "Daniel, why are you here?" He sat across from her, his expression gentle. "Because you needed someone who remembers who you were before Victor tried to erase you." The simple truth of it made tears spring to her eyes. She set down the coffee and pressed her palms against her face, finally allowing herself to break in front of someone she trusted. Daniel moved to sit beside her, close but not touching, respecting her space while offering his presence. "You're stronger than you think, Amora. I've always known that." "I don't feel strong," she whispered. "I feel like I've wasted 8 years of my life." "Then let's make sure the next 80 years are better," he said quietly. She looked up at him then, really looked, and saw something in his eyes that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. Admiration, tenderness, and something deeper that had perhaps always been there, waiting. The unexpected witness. The afternoon session began with an announcement that surprised everyone, including Amora. "Your Honor," Robert said, "the defense calls Daniel Foster to the stand." Amora's head snapped toward her lawyer in confusion. She hadn't known Daniel was on the witness list. Beside her, she felt her mother's reassuring touch on her shoulder. Daniel walked to the stand with quiet confidence, his eyes finding Amora's for just a moment before he was sworn in. He wore a simple grey suit, professional but unpretentious, so different from Victor's ostentatious display of wealth. "Mr. Foster," Robert began, "how do you know the defendant?" "I've known Amora since we were 7 years old," Daniel replied. "We grew up on the same street in Boston. We were best friends through high school." "And did you maintain contact after high school?" "We lost touch when I went to California for college," Daniel admitted. "But we reconnected through letters about 5 years ago. Amora reached out when she saw an article about my work in marine biology." Robert approached the bench with a box. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence approximately 60 letters exchanged between Mr. Foster and Mrs. Ashford over the past 5 years. Patricia shot to her feet. "Objection. This is highly irregular and has no bearing on." "I'll allow it," Judge Reynolds interrupted, her curiosity clearly piqued. "I'd like to hear where this is going." Robert handed Daniel one of the letters. "Mr. Foster, could you read the date and a passage from this letter?" Daniel's voice was steady but emotional as he read. "March 15th, 3 years ago. Dear Daniel, sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing. Victor came home angry about a business deal today, and I realized I'd spent the whole day afraid of his mood rather than living my own life. Do you remember when we were 12 and I told you I wanted to paint the ocean? I haven't picked up a brush in 2 years. I don't know who I am anymore." The courtroom was silent. Amora felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "And your response?" Robert prompted. "I reminded her that the Amora Bennett I knew was brave, creative, and brilliant. I told her she deserved to be with someone who celebrated those qualities rather than suppressed them." Patricia stood for cross-examination, her expression sharp. "Mr. Foster, isn't it true that you've been in love with Mrs. Ashford for years? That these letters represent an inappropriate emotional affair?" Daniel didn't flinch. "I care deeply for Amora, yes. But our correspondence was about friendship and support during a difficult time. I never once encouraged her to violate her marriage vows. I only encouraged her to remember her worth." "Yet here you are, conveniently present at her divorce trial," Patricia pressed. "I'm here because Amora's family contacted me 2 weeks ago. They showed me evidence of what Victor had done to her and asked if I'd be willing to testify about the woman I've always known her to be, someone kind, intelligent, and deserving of respect. Victor's lawyer tried several more angles, but Daniel remained unshakable. His testimony painted a picture of Amora that contradicted everything Victor had claimed, not a gold digger or a burden, but a woman who had sacrificed her identity for a man who never deserved her. When Daniel stepped down, he didn't return to the gallery. Instead, he took a seat directly behind Amora's table, close enough that she could feel his support like a shield at her back, truth and tenderness. The next morning brought Victor's financial records under scrutiny. Robert's team had discovered offshore accounts, hidden assets, and a pattern of financial manipulation that painted Victor not as the victim of a gold digger, but as a man who had systematically controlled every aspect of his wife's life. Mrs. Ashford had no access to bank accounts, Robert explained to the judge. No credit cards in her own name. She received a monthly allowance that required itemized receipts. When she wanted to donate to a charity for underprivileged children's art programs, Mr. Ashford denied her request, calling it frivolous. More witnesses came forward. Victor's own housekeeper testified about raised voices and thrown objects, about Amora's kindness to the staff even as Victor treated them with contempt. A former colleague of Victor's admitted under oath that Victor had bragged about keeping his wife in line. During a mid-morning recess, the judge called for a 30-minute break. Amora walked blindly toward the courthouse garden, needing air, needing space from the suffocating weight of her past being dissected in public. She found a bench beneath a maple tree, its leaves just beginning to turn gold with the approaching autumn. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Daniel approach until he spoke. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bench. She nodded, and he sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the distant traffic and the rustle of leaves. "I'm sorry you had to hear all of that," Amora finally said. "Reading my letters in court, having my life exposed like this." "Don't apologize," Daniel said firmly. "You have nothing to be sorry for." She turned to face him, and something in her expression must have shifted, because his breath caught. "Daniel, why did you really come?" He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for just a moment against her cheek. "Because," he said softly, "I've spent 13 years wondering what would have happened if I told you how I felt before you met Victor. I've read every letter you sent me 100 times. I've celebrated your small joys and ached for your sorrows from 3,000 miles away." Amora's heart was pounding. "Daniel, I'm not asking for anything," he continued quickly. "You need time to heal, to find yourself again. But I wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. Because the woman I've always known, the real Amora, is someone I would wait a lifetime for." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but these were different from the tears she'd shed in that courtroom. These were tears of relief, of hope, of something she'd forgotten how to feel. "I'm scared," she whispered. "What if I'm too broken?" Daniel took her hand gently in his. "You're not broken. You're recovering. There's a difference." Without thinking, Amora leaned forward and rested her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her carefully, protectively, and they sat like that until the bailiff called them back inside. When they stood to leave, Daniel kept hold of her hand, and this time, she didn't let go. New beginnings. Judge Reynolds delivered her ruling on a Friday afternoon, when the autumn sun streamed through the courthouse windows like a benediction. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," she began, her voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "What I've seen is a pattern of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and systematic erosion of Mrs. Ashford's autonomy and self-worth." Victor sat rigid in his chair, his expensive lawyer unusually quiet beside him. "Mr. Ashford, you will retain your business assets and your personal investment portfolio. However, Mrs. Ashford is entitled to 50% of all marital assets acquired during your marriage, including the penthouse apartment, the vacation home in the Hamptons, and appropriate alimony for a period of no less than 4 years to allow her to re-establish her career and independence." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and it was over. 8 years of marriage dissolved in an instant. Amora felt her mother's arms around her, heard Elias's triumphant laugh, but all she could focus on was the feeling of Daniel's hand squeezing hers beneath the table. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered like moths around Victor as he descended the steps, still trying to maintain his dignity even in defeat. Amora, her family, and Daniel slipped out a side exit into the golden afternoon. "We should celebrate," Elias declared. "Dinner at Mom's favorite restaurant." Celeste smiled at her daughter. "What do you say, sweetheart?" But Amora was looking at Daniel, seeing the question in his eyes, the gentle, patient question that asked if she wanted space or company, solitude or connection. "Could we take a walk first?" Amora asked. "Just the two of us." Her family exchanged knowing glances and made their excuses. Celeste kissed her daughter's forehead, and Elias clapped Daniel on the shoulder with a meaningful look that said take care of her. They walked in silence to a nearby park, where families played and dogs chased frisbees and the world felt impossibly normal after the intensity of the trial. They found a quiet path lined with oak trees, their leaves creating a canopy of amber and gold. "I don't know how to do this," Amora admitted, stopping to face him. "How to be myself again, how to trust again, how to even think about the future." Daniel stepped closer, his presence warm and steady. "Then don't think about the future. Just think about right now. What do you want in this moment?" Amora looked up at him, at the face that had been kind to her since childhood, at the eyes that had never looked at her with anything but respect and admiration. She thought about his letters that had sustained her through the darkest years, about his testimony that had helped free her, about the way he'd waited 13 years without ever demanding anything in return. "I want to not be afraid anymore," she whispered. "Then be brave with me," he said softly. "We'll figure out the rest together." He raised his hand slowly, telegraphing his intention, giving her every opportunity to step back. Instead, she leaned into his touch as his palm cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't known was falling. "Amora," he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. She rose on her toes and kissed him, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. It was nothing like the calculated kisses Victor had given her. This was gentle and real and filled with years of unspoken feeling. Daniel's arms came around her, holding her like she was precious, like she was chosen. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Amora laughed, actually laughed, for what felt like the first time in years. "Too soon?" she asked, suddenly worried. "No," Daniel said, his forehead resting against hers. 13 years too late, maybe, but not too soon. They walked back through the park hand in hand as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Amora's phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "Take your time, sweetheart. We'll be waiting when you're ready." "My family likes you," Amora observed. "I like them too," Daniel replied. "Your mother makes excellent coffee, and your brother only threatened me with bodily harm once if I ever hurt you." She laughed again, the sound growing easier each time. "What happens now?" "Now." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Now you take time to heal. You pick up a paintbrush again. You figure out who Amora Bennett is when she's not living in someone else's shadow. And if you want company while you do that, I'll be right here." "What about California? Your work?" "I can do marine biology research from Boston," he said simply. "Or New York, if you decide to stay here. Or anywhere you want to go. I'm flexible." Amora felt something unfold in her chest, hope, possibility, the first green shoots of a new life pushing through the scorched earth of the old one. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to go back to Boston. Start fresh where I have good memories." "Then Boston it is," Daniel agreed. As they headed toward the restaurant where her family waited, Amora realized that for the first time in 8 years, she was walking toward something rather than away from it. She was walking toward family, toward friendship, toward the possibility of a love built on respect and equality rather than control and fear. The divorce had set her free, but this, Daniel's hand in hers, the autumn air on her face, the future stretching out like an open road, this was what living actually felt like. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for waiting. For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Daniel squeezed her hand. "That's what love does," he said simply. "It waits. It believes. It hopes." And as they walked into the warm light of the restaurant, where her mother's face lit up with joy and her brother raised a glass in celebration, Amora Bennett finally understood what it meant to be truly seen, truly valued, and truly free. Lessons from the heart. Love waits patiently for the right moment and never demands what cannot be freely given. True strength is found not in enduring suffering silently, but in having the courage to walk away from what diminishes you. Family and genuine friendship are the foundations upon which we rebuild ourselves when life tears us down. The greatest romance blooms not from passion alone, but from respect, patience, and seeing another person's truest self. The end.